Hello and welcome back to the State of Politics, where last time we were talking about the life and thought of Socrates, and this time we'll be talking about definitely his most famous disciple, Plato. How are you, Nate? You looking forward to this one?
I'm looking forward to this one. Yeah, I am looking forward to this one. I just think it's generally interesting as we sort of start progressing through it, and we can piece little bits together, sort of ancient thought to modern thought, and the building blocks and things. So yeah, I think it's going to be interesting, to be honest.
I think we really do need to do the trifecta of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. So perhaps
Mm.
next time we'll do Aristotle, and then we can move on to other things. But they are they are a foundation of philosophy for the West, anyway, in the Western tradition. But particularly for what we're looking at is politics.
Mm.
But there's so much to Plato. I mean, even given an hour and a half, however we go on this one, however long we go on this one, we'll only really be scratching the surface of Plato because there is quite a lot. So that's one of the first things to say, that there's 36 texts
Mm.
that you can get for Plato, and real scholars say that might represent nearly everything that was actually written down. Because in the ancient world, the way it works is we've got things that we say survive to the modern age, but then quite often within those texts that survive, there'll be reference to other things which don't survive. So, for example, among the ancient historians, someone like Tacitus or Polybius, we know that they wrote a massive body of work, but only a fraction of it or bits of it survive. And we can quite often piece together what we don't have.
Mm.
But it seems with Plato, there's no reference anywhere else of any other work by Plato which we haven't got. Now, that's extremely rare.
That's
It's
super
extremely,
unusual, isn't
extremely
it?
rare.
That's
Yeah. It's
yeah,
remarkable. Well, see,
interesting.
what it suggests, really, isn't it, is that from the time when he actually lived, which was the 400s and 300s BC, people sort of were interested in what he had to say immediately and sort of never stopped being interested by him.
Mm.
It does divide opinion a bit. That's another thing I'd like to say straight off the bat. Some people think that Platonic thought is excellent and extremely valuable, among the most valuable philosophy, certain ancient philosophy, and others say he's completely wrong about loads and loads of things, sort of at a conceptual level, and is sort of a dead end, and is sort of yeah. So all sorts of philosophers over the ages have had different critiques of him.
Mm.
Um, People like someone like Kant disagrees with him a fair bit. Nietzsche again disagrees with him quite heavily.
Mm.
So some people love him, some people hate him. Bit of a Marmite figure. I think that a lot of what he says is it's from the ancient world, so it's not going to map onto our modern scientific 21st century mind
Mm.
perfectly. There's loads of things where you look at it, you read it, and you think, well, that's just wrong.
Yeah.
We sort of know now that isn't right.
Yeah.
Or well, anyway, when we get into it, we'll critique it as we go along.
Mm. Yeah, it's kind of like the obvious thing, though, isn't it? Like, I mean, that's to critique him too heavily. You're sort of doing a disservice to your own intelligence. That's, your own intelligence. That's like saying Lovecraft, for instance, to pull out, a literary figure. He was bigoted. You're like, yeah, okay. You pull anyone from any era, it doesn't map directly onto our current sort of sphere and how we view things, or our sort of intellectual prowess. Now it's never going to work. So to critique it on that level is always a bit dim.
Yeah, it's an anachronism, isn't it, to judge things in the past by today's standards? But people do it crazily. I mean, even in our lifetimes, even in the last 10, 15, 20 years, that seems to have exploded.
Oh yeah, no, yeah, more
So
more so now than ever, bizarrely. But that's because we, well, I mean, we'll be looking at some sort of ethical, sort of elements of Plato, I'm sure. But it's very much the sort of virtue signaling mob that are sort of taken over. Everything is judged by this sort of holier than thou current standard. It can't get any better than now, even though it does every single month. The standard raises and blah blah blah. So bizarre, strange that it's gone so crazy in then.
like, for example, some people nowadays usually lefties, uh, criticize someone like George Washington or Thomas Jefferson for owning slaves. It doesn't really matter that Jefferson emancipated some of his slaves, and Washington and Jefferson tried very, very hard to stop slavery. None of that matters. He was a slave owner. That's the end of the story. Same for Plato. Plato actually explicitly is in favor of slavery, for example. But he lived 350, 400 years before Christ. So
What'd you expect?
Yeah, exactly. What do you expect? It's a different world. It's really almost a lost world to us. Now, that's one of the next things to say, is to sort of, like I did with Socrates, try and put him in his historical context, because we have to start there, really, just to talk about his philosophy as if it were just a floating thing. No, let's look at the man and what happened in his life and what he went through.
What shaped him? That nature versus
Yeah.
nurture thing again. I like that. I like that very much.
Right. So he was born just about when the Peloponnesian War started, so in the 420s BC. And so all his formative, like I guess he wouldn't have remembered Pericles. And so all of his young life, when he was a child and a young man in his 20s, early 20s and things, was the Peloponnesian War. They think almost certainly he fought in at least one battle right towards the end of the Peloponnesian, or perhaps fought in a war with Corinth a bit later. But and so he was born into a fairly well-to-do family. Again, we don't know the details very, very well. We've got sort of a name of his mother and father, and we know that they were quote unquote aristocratic, but beyond that, we don't really have any real details. He certainly wasn't. They weren't sort of massively rich, like Crassus rich. Or
well, you'd know more.
They weren't. They weren't
otherwise,
lonely,
wouldn't you? I mean, the text would illustrate that, I'm sure. So.
And his family had connections with the oligarchs, that period of the 30 tyrants. So, and he was a fan of Socrates, perhaps disciple, a student of Socrates, one of those young men that sort of followed him around for any sort of tidbit that might fall from his lips, writing down things that he did and said, because each one is, liquid gold. He was one of those guys. He was in that clique. And he was in his, what would have been, I suppose, sort of his mid-20s when Socrates was put on trial and of course, executed for his supposed crimes. So again, when you're a child or a teenager, they're really your formative years, but still things that happen to you in your 20s are still, if you go on to live a relatively long life into your 50s,
brain
60s,
is still
70s.
developing. So, your sort of rational self, that sort of part of your brain, that still develops, past 25, to be fair. That's just one age that they gave. So, yeah, I mean, seeing your idol, your sort of philosophical god, as it were, being put to death, that must have affected him, I would have imagined.
No, absolutely, definitely. It definitely did. And we see that reflected in a lot of the things he said. And we know that out of his 36 texts, not all of them is literally his thinking put into the mouth of Socrates, but a lot of the early ones are that. So yeah, he idolized man. And a lot of his philosophy, certainly the earlier stuff, is sort of Socrates' philosophy, it seems. It's very difficult for us to really untangle exactly where Socrates ends and where Plato begins in all sorts of ways. One last thing before we sort of jump into it, just to say about those 36 texts. We're not entirely sure if they're all by Plato, in fact. So for a long time, for a long time, through the medieval period, I mean, people thought all of these were by Plato. But now on one end of the spectrum, some scholars say that only 5 or 6 of them are actually by Plato. And on the other end of the spectrum, people say, no, only 5 or 6 of them aren't by him. The vast majority are by him. And it seems to be that the consensus is more that. There's a few of them where they seem out of place, and the actual philosophy in it is contradictory to other things. So 1 or 2 of them people were suspicious of, but
Yeah.
It seems like it is mostly him. And actually, that leads me on to one other point I'll say before I jump back into his life, the details of his life. Is that he, like any good philosopher, I think, like any good thinker, is that it seems that his ideas and his thinking changed over time
Mm.
or evolved over time. Well, they certainly did. They certainly did, and that's a healthy thing,
That's
surely.
unequivocally a healthy thing. You must be malleable in your thoughts because it shows that you are actually shaped by the world around you. It also shows that you yourself are self-aware. You yourself are self-aware. Shows that you are self-aware. Because if you're not, you believe you're infallible, and then thus you're a moron. It also goes directly against what Socrates had previously said, wasn't it? You know, I'm not I'm not the wisest man because I don't know if I don't know all of this stuff and etc. etc. So yeah, you must be malleable to the world around you. You have to change your thinking. It can't always be just this stagnant line. It also can't be linear either. That's the ebb and flow. You might go backwards on some thinking and forwards.
Right. And that's one of the things that, again, scholars of philosophy spend a fair bit of time looking at and talking about and debating is that, oh, look, Plato's contradicted what he said earlier here. And he obviously used to think this, but in the middle part of his life, he's now saying this. And at the end, the text we think he wrote when he was old, it says yet another thing. But what that leads to is a bit of a difficulty in saying Plato thought this one thing. This is what
Mm,
Plato thought about this, like the nature of justice, or the nature of love, or art, or what is good and things,
mm,
or the nature of the soul. Right at the beginning, one of his the earliest work, the Apology, which is Socrates' trial, and then the one about Crito about his death. He has Socrates saying that different things about the nature of immortality and the soul and reincarnation. And later, Plato says other things, completely contradictory things, really, about that.
mm,
So, um, and there is one other thing to say that people, because there's so much text and because they are a bit contradictory, or he seems to have changed his mind over time,
mm.
um, different people can read Plato and come to quite different conclusions about what he's actually saying. And he's not always 100% clear, or he does leave something sort of unsaid or unexplained,
Mm.
and so that leaves you open to just an interpretation, right? It means someone can read you and say, well, no, I don't, that's not what he's saying, that's not what he meant.
Yeah.
And so ever since then, 2000 plus years later, people still argue like what Plato meant by certain things.
I think
So
there's a beauty in that with philosophy, though, right? Like uh, to not state that something is unequivocal, and that there is, I don't know how to word it. That almost represents philosophy in general, right? Like something which is you can sort of ponder on something and think about it and form some relatively poignant / constructive musings, but not dial it down to one singular, yes, this is what I think, etc., etc. And having it open to a level of interpretation is like a pretty good representation of philosophy as a whole, because there is no one true philosophy to live your life. Even Plato, for instance, didn't, ebbed and flowed with his thoughts. So I'd say a good philosopher, and we sort of represented that when we spoke about his changing thoughts. Again, it constantly changes, right? So I don't know. I quite like that. I think that's be wary of people that have all the answers, I guess is the phrase, isn't it?
right, absolutely. I mean, that is one of the cornerstones of what Socrates said, isn't it?
Mm,
Um, Being dogmatic is hardly ever, if ever, really the best way to go with things.
yeah.
Well, it will almost certainly lead you to ruin eventually. But there you go. Having said all that, Plato is sort of very staunch about certain things as well. At the same time, that's what he's like. He's a fairly difficult philosopher to sort of really put your finger on exactly. You know, like later modern philosophers, 20th century philosophers, Wittgenstein or something. They're like really quite clear, even if it is difficult language. They're quite clear what they meant, and then they would do many lectures, hours worth of lectures, where they explain exactly what they meant. And then they had lots of conversations with people that grilled them very properly and seriously over and over again. And they wrote about it. Also, it's much more in the light of history now, of course. And Plato isn't. I mean, he's in the light of history. He's a historical figure. There's no doubt about that. But a lot of what he said is a bit ambiguous, and there is room for interpretation. Okay, so having caveated Plato from about 5 different angles there, let's go back to his life. So it's thought that he travelled a fair bit after Socrates was executed. That he travelled. Some say he travelled to Egypt. A lot of people insist that he travelled to Egypt just because of various things he wrote that you can read between the lines. That he said this here or there. It means he definitely had an understanding of Egyptian thinking and sort of civil thought, laws, politics, and things. So he must have gone to Egypt. But there's no proper evidence that he did. There's nothing in any of his writing where he said, when I went to Egypt, I saw this and did this or that.
Just read
People just infer that he went to Egypt, but we don't know that he did. Other scholars argue, say, no, he didn't. He did. I'll stake my reputation on the fact that Plato never went to Egypt. He did certainly go to Italy and Sicily, though. There's a strong old connection between Athens and Sicily. And he became friends with the brother-in-law of the tyrant on Sicily, of Syracuse. He fell out of favour with him, and it was one more example. People have said it's one more example where Plato became disillusioned with politics. He was obviously sickened and disillusioned by Athenian politics, obviously having seen the events of the Peloponnesian War, and then saw what happened with the 30 tyrants, and then the return to democracy and demagogues like Alcibiades, and the death of his god Socrates. That's the wrong word. his master Socrates. So he was already very disillusioned with sort of the politics of men. And then when he went to Syracuse, when he went to Sicily, again, it was sort of quite a bad experience for him in the end. He went there more than once. He went there at least twice. And probably the second time was sort of probably chased out or escaped just about with his life because his friend there was sort of out of favour. And many years later, when he was old, his friend became the ruler of Syracuse and then was assassinated. So even towards the end of his life, he was yet another bitter pill to have to swallow for him personally. So when he returned to Athens after his travels, wherever they were exactly, he was probably about 40 by that point. And famously, he's known that he found a school, or the academy, or sometimes called the Old Academy. And some people said it's a little bit. I think it's a little bit low resolution to say this. Nonetheless, it also holds true to some extent. It's the first university, not exactly anything like a modern university. But it's a place where young men can go to kind of exclusively learn. And it wasn't just philosophy, ethics, metaphysics. It wasn't just. It was all sorts of things. Sort of the natural sciences, what back then they called the natural sciences. Even things like botany, things like politics. Very, very small, where they think the ruins of it are just outside Athens. It's very, very, very small place. It's not like this sprawling campus or anything. But it did. It did draw in lots of thinkers who in the next generation or two became all the leading lights, least of all Aristotle. And a lot of what we know about Plato, because Plato doesn't really talk about himself directly very much, hardly at all really, in his dialogues, in the text. But Aristotle did. Most of what we know about the actual man, Plato, comes from Aristotle, and I guess we'll talk about that more next time or whenever we do
Well,
Aristotle.
it's a domino effect of philosophical idols of one another. You know, Socrates plays into Plato. Plato plays into Aristotle. I mean, Aristotle even founded his own school.
Hmm.
You know, after Plato. So it's very much that sort of domino effect of philosophical idols just bleeding into one another. It's interesting. It's good.
It's a great, as I say, the trifecta.
Mm.
Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. They're great. If anyone is interested in this stuff, they sort of come in that pack of three, and yeah, you're not really finished with it until you're finished with Aristotle, I think. Okay, so Athens was a very different place by the time Plato is in his 40s or in his later life, into his 50s or 60s. It wasn't such a turbulent place as what it had been
Mm.
during the life or earlier life, certainly, of Socrates. So Plato was never in any real trouble of being put on trial for being subversive or anything like that. In fact, maybe one of the first things we could say about him is his idea about the gods, because one of the things Socrates was accused of, wasn't it, was being subversive when it came to the gods and religion, and sort of denying various aspects of various gods. And he
Ran afoul of
Socrates in
that,
this trial,
unfortunately.
he insisted he hadn't done anything of the sort. But Plato explicitly talks about how, like, being an atheist is a terrible thing, like really, really terrible. Like, should be punished extremely harshly, and you've completely gone down sort of a cul-de-sac if you find yourself being an atheist. Um, so that's one of the things. That's one of the things he says. So I suppose the allegory of the cave and the concept of forms and things is Plato's most famous thing in the Republic. The Republic's is my well thumbed copy of the Republic. If you're going to read one text by or listen to it on audiobook, it's got to be the Republic, really. And I think in that he talks all about his allegory of the cave. But before we get on to that and the nature of reality, I think we need to talk about, at least briefly, his idea of knowledge.
Mm.
And this does build directly on Socrates, and a lot of what we think is just Plato speaking, but he's put the words in the mouth of Socrates in a dialogue. All about knowledge. How do we know anything? How can we know anything? Like, are you sure of what you know?
Mm.
Right? Because it is sort of a fairly fundamental thing. Because if you're not sort of clear on that, or if you don't think you're clear on that sort of thing, then anything else you come to conclusions about is, built on a foundation of sand or something, isn't it?
Yeah.
Can we know anything? So later philosophers, sort of Renaissance era philosophers, modern philosophers, some of them say, no, the answer to that question is a no, you can't know anything. Right? Other people say, that's nonsense, of course you can, don't be silly. Yeah, you can. Yeah. What are we doing here?
Yeah.
Otherwise.
There are finite things which we can all believe for sure. Or know, should I say.
So Plato did say that there is such thing as being able to know anything.
Mm.
But you do have to be careful. When we talked about the pre-Socratics, one of the ones we talked about was Heraclitus, wasn't it? And he was one of the people that said you can't trust your own senses. Like they lie to you. And in some ways, I mean, Heraclitus went to extreme lengths, but in some senses, it's sort of just definitely true, that, isn't it? I mean, for example, the idea of a mirage.
Mm. Yeah.
Right? Your eyes are lying to you. And if you didn't know any better, you would just take that as quote unquote real.
Yeah, there's some extenuating circumstances where your
Hmm.
your senses absolutely would, be fooling you, but not on the whole. Not on the whole.
Or like the idea of to use a modern example, I was reading Frederick Copleston talking about. He gave an example of when you see a railroad track, a really really long straight railroad track,
Mm.
disappearing off into the horizon to a vanishing point, and it looks like the two rails come together,
Yeah,
sort of at the vanishing
perception.
point,
Yeah.
and they just don't. It just looks like it does. So your eyeballs,
But then
your
we
sense perception are
yeah,
not to be trusted.
but then we know that it doesn't do that. You know,
Right.
it's like
Yeah.
yeah. That's an interesting one. That is an interesting.
But that's just an example. There might be many other ones. I've heard another one where, like, if you got bowls of hot and cold water, and you heat your hands up by a fire, and then put them in the cold water, it feels very different to if you hadn't heated your hands up
Mm.
in the first place.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
there are actually all sorts of examples where your senses could lead you awry,
True,
basically.
and I guess in that era as well, in that sort of time span or that time period of civilization, that their key sort of religious beliefs as well were very much more on the well, all religion has a fantastical element, but believing in sirens and medusas and gorgons and all these kind of things, you
Mm,
know, they would have come from somewhere, and likely, a lot of that would having a susceptibility to believing that these things were true as well. You can fool your senses into believing that you're seeing all sorts of various bits and pieces. So yeah, I guess
mm,
so. I guess so to a degree, but then that's very civilizational dependent, actually, that as a philosophical concept. Like it's not true. It's direct. The amount you can believe your senses has a direct correlation to what we know in the sciences. So your example of the hands, heat, hot, cold, water, etc. To know fully what happens with your nervous system.
mhm.
Well, you can discount that because you know what's actually happening. You know the time span it takes for there's two different nervous systems. Well, two nervous responses, one slow, one fast. You know that. Yes, interesting. It is just interesting.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's lots of other things like would you if you saw a piece of art which was so realistic, you might mistake it for real. Uh, so, for example, like an ultra realistic, like Madame Tussauds waxwork,
Mm,
and you saw it from a distance, and you only glanced at it. So there's just all sorts. There's many
yeah.
examples, but of course you're right. When you get up to sort of our scientific times,
Mm,
you can sort of unpick these things and sort of gets to what's real. I mean, some modern physicists and things, they say things like, when you get down to the atomic or subatomic level, like you can't, or certainly subatomic level, you can't necessarily know things for
mm,
certain. Like Heisenberg's
true.
uncertainty principle and all that sort of thing, or nearly everything that an atom is made up of is empty. Anyway, that's Plato had no concept of those things exactly, so we won't dwell on that. But just his concept of knowledge, or his and Socrates's and the ancient Athenians, his contemporaries, idea of what knowledge is. How can we know something for sure?
Mm,
Um, and when you think you know something, and then you're shown by someone that that's not really what knowledge is. So for example, another example is someone could teach you something about geometry,
mm,
could teach you something about the nature of maths and numbers, and they tell you this is true, and they show you it with an actual mathematical proof, a logic. They say this is definitely true. Here you go, and it always works, right? It always works, so it sort of is true. But you yourself don't know that. You didn't do the actual maths in the first place. You don't necessarily understand the proof,
mm.
right? I mean, we must all, nearly everyone, unless you're an actual university level mathematician, we all have to deal with that, don't we?
Yeah, no, that's true.
When
That's true.
we're told these are the laws of thermodynamics, these are the laws of astrophysics, these are the laws of quantum physics, and
Mm,
we just have to go. okay, someone more clever than
Right
me
then.
has shown that to be true. I can't actually, if I'm honest, I can't actually claim that I know that for sure.
Mm,
I'm just taking it on their word,
yeah.
and that in fact that's what most of us are doing most of the time.
Yeah. True.
Actually,
True. True. True.
um, so have you got knowledge of that thing, or you're just accepting what someone else has
Mm,
shown to be knowledge? And so is that knowledge or not? Anyway, it goes on and on. There's so much about Plato that we could, if you wanted to, we won't, but if one wanted to, we could do a whole episode just about Plato's concept of knowledge, just all about his concept of laws, just about his concept of poetry and things. So, but we'll move on from that because the knowledge thing does lead into his idea of concept. So he would say that you largely, like almost entirely, if not entirely, can't trust your senses at all.
mm,
Um, that they are in fact lying to you almost wholesale. Now, this is where a lot of people, some philosophers, go along with that and agree with that and build on that in all sorts of ways, and others say, no, that's just simply wrong-headed. You've just sort of got it wrong,
mm,
right? But nonetheless, it's one of his most famous ideas, most famous concepts. So he would talk about in his concept of forms is that there was sort of various layers to reality. So at the bottom, you've got sort of things that are imitations of reality. So things like a drawing or a piece of art, or even like shadows
mm,
or reflections. You know, so you know, it's sort of a funny, interesting idea. Is your reflection real? Is it a real thing? I mean, nowadays we would talk about light, wouldn't we? So if you asked a modern person that who knew anything about science, they would just start talking about light, and that's what it is,
mm.
right? But
Yeah, they'd
if you go back to
explain it,
the
wouldn't they?
ancient world,
That's what they do.
or like yeah, it's like shadows or art. These are imitations of of what we think is real. And then there's sort of the flesh and blood world we see around us at all times. The things that our sense perceptions, you know, hearing, touch, sight, smell, the things that we experience directly on a day-to-day basis. But that's not the end of the story. Beyond that, there's things that are concepts. So things a bit like geometry, things like maths, even things like the concept of love or the concept of justice or something. That these are sort of higher concepts. That he argued that they're sort of more real than the things you can touch and see and smell and hear, because they're more beautiful. It's a bit of a different word to how we would use the word beautiful now, but they're closer to perfection.
Mm,
Um, because the world all around us is in flux at all times. I mean, that's sort of true, isn't it? From moment to moment, you know, if you see, imagine this thought experiment: you see someone when they're a child or a teenager. The last time you saw someone, they were 15 years old.
mm,
Okay, 15 years goes past. They're now a 30-year-old, but you haven't seen them since they were 15. But to you, the only reality of them is your memory of when they were 15. So that reality isn't correct.
mm. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
You know,
Yeah, true.
you see what I mean?
Yeah, true, true. I mean,
Um,
he's right anyway. That everything is in flux as a constant anyway,
mm,
even within
mm.
yourself. I mean, well, I guess he would have known that. I mean, that's almost an example of that. Like each of your cells are constantly in flux at any given moment. So, yeah, it's an interesting thought, really.
And as is the whole world, like an apple sits there and rots very slowly, or grows on the tree, falls down, then rots, or even like stones. Eventually, even the rocks eventually
Mm,
wear away. That literally everything is in flux, but some things aren't. Like in geometry, like the idea that the two smaller sides of a triangle, the area of the other two add up to the long one.
mm.
That is perfect. That never changes. Like that isn't in flux, right?
True, but is
So
that
that's higher.
natural? Is that
That's
part
of
of
a
the
higher
natural world?
order of things. Sorry, I spoke over you a bit
No, I
there.
was just saying, but is that part of the natural world? I think that clearly defines
Well,
separates two things, right? Like it separates the the natural world is constantly in flux. Like there is no the only constant in the natural world is the constant state of change. Whereas in
Right.
in the more sort of manufactured elements of the world, yeah, that's when things can become true and yeah, sort of not ever changing. I guess. Try to get my words out.
Mm. Yeah. But I mean, people would argue that something like the laws of geometry, they are part of the world, even though they're not tangible. You can't touch them. They are sort of, not only are they true or quote unquote real, Plato would argue they're more real
Yeah, see, I would disagree.
because, right, fair enough.
Well, I would
Yeah,
disagree
maybe do.
because without humans, it wouldn't even be a concept. There's nowhere in the planet where that shape exists as a permanent. Like a triangle, for instance. There is no like a perfect circle. It doesn't exist. Doesn't exist without artificial intervention. So I guess you could argue by extension because humans did it. It's natural, but it's not natural. So anyway, that's what I was interested in.
No, absolutely. It's an interesting conversation. So, but the idea that maybe a perfect triangle or perfect circle doesn't exist in nature, but yet the laws of geometry do exist or would exist even
Mm,
if there were no humans, right? Because we can see when you look out into space and things like that that that
mm.
certain laws of mathematics and physics do exist regardless of whether there's any humans to measure them or think about them.
Yeah, no, you're
Um,
completely right. I mean, that just goes into the whole. Well, does it's Schrodinger's cat essentially, isn't it? If we weren't around to observe it, do they really exist? Are they observable if we're not here? But yeah, it is interesting. It is very interesting.
I always argue on that one. Yes,
Well, yeah,
yes, of course.
obviously.
Does a tree make a sound in a forest if there's no one to hear it?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, it does. Yeah,
Just
if
no
it's
one
not in a
heard it.
vacuum, it will make a noise. Yeah, but anyway, um, but then Plato takes it another step further, saying that
Mm,
there's something sort of above those sort of concepts. That there's sort of a perfect realm of forms or of ideas,
mm,
where there's a version of all things, even the things that we experience with our senses.
mm,
There'll be a sort of a perfect Platonic form of that thing. Take the idea of a chair or a dog. There's many different types of chair, many different types of dog, but there is in fact one perfect concept of a chair or a dog. And everything we see in the real world is sort of just an imperfect version of that one perfect form
mm.
of it. So
Interesting.
now, a lot of people, when they hear that or first hear that, just go, "What? That's obviously nonsense. Where is this? Where is this realm where all these perfect forms are? What? That's nonsense. Of course, that's nonsense. Next thing. What did Aristotle say about it? Anyway? Like some people just completely dismiss it out of hand.
Mm,
Um, and people have also argued, as I mentioned earlier, that Plato is sometimes ambiguous. Did he really think that? Like,
mm,
was this just an allegory and a metaphor, or did he actually think exactly that? And it
mm,
does seem, if you read enough of Plato, it does seem that he did think it. That he actually did think that was sort of really what was going on. That the reality we see around us is is a fake,
mm.
is misleading, and that there's the real world is this realm of perfect perfect forms.
All right.
So now this idea he wasn't the first to come up with this, with sort of that version of that idea. In all sorts of cultures we have that idea and we still play with it today.
Mm,
Just in broad terms, the idea that the world we see around us is fake in some way, and that there's a higher, truer better place
Mm.
somewhere else. I mean, so just for example, two examples in the Matrix. They wake up in that bathtub full of gel, right,
Yeah,
into
yeah.
the real world. That's the real world, and the world of cities and everything we see around us. That's the fake. Or in Inception, I rewatched Inception a couple of weeks ago.
You're
There's an
referencing movies. Let me reference Lovecraft again.
okay,
So in Lovecraft's text, he has obviously, you know, his sort of genre is defined as sort of vagueness, right? It's the sort of similar to, I guess, some form of philosophies, but he believes in his pantheon of these elder gods, these dark beings, is that there is one god that is asleep, and we are just his dream. And if he was to wake up, he's being serenaded by these nightmarish creatures. But if he was to wake up, all existence would extinguish, because existence isn't existence. We are just existing in his dream. Bringing it back to a literary reference.
it's a lovely idea, and there's lots and lots of cultures all over the world since ancient times have had versions of this. Many versions of
Mm.
this exact thing. I think I might be wrong. In Hinduism, I think there's a version of that reality is sort of a dream of one of the gods, or that
I think.
or that the gods are just one of our dreams.
Mm.
Or there's it, even though Plato put very specific parameters on his version of it, it's far from unique. I mean, even in Inception, when I was rewatching Inception a couple of weeks ago, there was a line in it where I did think it immediately just made me think of Plato when Leonardo DiCaprio's wife goes mad in it because he says there's just this one little idea that lodged in her brain that grew and grew and grew and she could not defeat or get away from.
Mm.
Just the idea that our world isn't real, and it could send you mad. It really could send you mad.
Yeah.
Well, there you go. So let's talk a bit about the allegory of the cave, because that is probably the most famous thing Plato's known for. So we can't really talk about Plato without discussing it a bit. And this idea of knowledge, about can we know things, and what we think we do know, how sure are we, and what is real, and all that sort of thing. So in his allegory of the cave, I mean, it's a metaphor for everyone's journey from ignorance to knowledge, right? We're all born as actually Plato didn't agree with what I'm about to say, but I think everyone now thinks it's true, is that we're all born without any knowledge, and you go through your journey of life along the arrow of time, and if you learn things, you become more and more knowledgeable. So that's a journey that we all go through, and along that journey you have like growing pains, essentially. Like becoming more and more knowledgeable about things sometimes makes you unhappy, and sometimes there's like a revelation where a blindfold is taken away from your eyes, and like the new light that you can see is too bright and stuff. So anyway, so the allegory of the cave, he said that imagine there's a cave, and the people in the cave are the normal people, the normal enlightened non-philosopher people, are sitting in the cave with their backs to the entrance, and they're looking at the back wall of the cave, the darkened back wall of the cave. And between the entrance and the back wall of the cave is a fire, casting shadows on the back wall that they can see. And all these people, the normal people, they're not able to turn around. They're shackled in a certain way, perhaps against an interior wall where they can't turn around and see. They're not aware that they're in a cave.
Mm.
All they know is the shadows they see cast on the back wall of the cave. And various things pass between the fire and their backs, like a bird or a chair or even the sun. It passes in front of the fire and casts a shadow on the back wall of the cave, and that's all they can ever see. That's all they've ever experienced. And they think it's real. They think it's all there is. So they don't know any better. And then in Plato's allegory, one of them, the man that's on the journey of knowledge, that is unshackled or escapes one way or another, and sees that he's just in his cave, and he goes outside and sees the quote unquote real world. And at first, it's too much. It's far too much for him. It's over. It's just overload, and sort of terrifying, and worrying and scary. And he closes his eyes to it because he can't hack it. Eventually, he's able to sort of, at first, just see. He's able to sort of just let himself see shadows at first, easing himself in, or even see his reflection in a river or something. But eventually, as his journey of enlightenment progresses, he's able to sort of fully open his eyes and see the real world, and even look up at the sun. And far from being overloaded or upset, it's glorious.
Mm.
He's far richer of a human than he could ever have imagined because of it. Now he's enlightened and he's got real knowledge. He goes back into the cave to tell his compadres, his mates who are still shackled in the cave. He tells them about it. And not only don't they want to hear about it, they think he's gone mad, or they persecute him for it, and chew him out for daring to say such nonsense things. Right now, there you can see an echo of what happened to Socrates.
Yeah.
Socrates tried to enlighten the people of Athens, and they turned on him.
Mm. It's interesting, isn't it? Because that that applies so widely, even even today, of course. People, and again in politics as well. People are easier to control when they're not shown all the facts. If you want to relate it to politics, for instance, people are easy to control, and then you can't control everyone, of course. So tends to be the minority that acquire knowledge for themselves, and those are the ones which are excluded. They're the black sheep. Those are the ones that are espousing nonsense according to the majority, generally speaking, as it were. So yeah, it's interesting. I like that. I like it. Well, I don't like it in actuality, but it's still a good allegory. I like it.
I mean, ignorance is bliss in various times, in all sorts
Sadly.
of times. Lots of people are happy to take the blue pill.
Mm.
Is that the right pill? The one where you stay ignorant?
Yes.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
because you get red
to take
pill.
the blue pill. Yeah. Lots of people sort of know that there's a red pill out there and deliberately don't take it. They're happy with it.
Yeah. Well, to relate it to religion ever so slightly, I always thought there was, I'm not religious remotely, and I don't demean people who have religion, but I'm almost envious of people to have that divine belief in something greater than themselves, just because that is, in my opinion, and I know I'll cop some flack for this, but that's a form of ignorance is bliss. And again, that's quite a bold statement to people who are religious, but look at it from an atheist perspective. You're going to look at that and go, well, yeah, that is a form of ignorance. Ignorance is bliss in that regard. But it's belief. It is a belief, isn't it? It is a form of just a blind belief in something higher than you. So it's interesting.
Yeah, having faith. That is the right word, to have faith in something.
Yeah.
I just have faith that there's a God. There's no evidence for it, but I don't need any. Explicitly, don't need any because I have faith. So with Plato, he talk about how, again, it's that allegory of the journey from ignorance to knowledge, or non-ignorance, should we say? And that a lot of people they don't want to hear it. They don't want to hear it. So Plato would say, sort of almost by definition, or some people are not really capable of understanding it even, so, Plato would say. So you're going to have some people in the world that are philosophers, that do go outside the cave, and are happy to, and many, perhaps the majority, that don't. So there's different classes now. There are definitely different classes of people. So all of that really is Plato's metaphysics, but that wasn't the only philosophy he had. He obviously had a philosophy of ethics and and various other things, aesthetics, even though aesthetics is like an 18th century word, but still, we know what we mean by it, really. One of the things, though, one of the criticisms I think it's worth saying is the main one that people say, the main one that first sprung to my mind before I even read any other criticisms of Plato is okay, how do you know that real world, that quote unquote real world outside the cave, how do you know that's the end of the onion? How do you know that's not another form of cave?
Yeah.
Right? Is that definitely the reality now, Plato? Is it? Is there not another layer, not another realm where the truly real things exist, and you're seeing a better version of the shadows, but it's not the actual final one? And then if you did see the next one, how do you know that's the final layer? And on and on and on.
Yeah.
Right. So, and Plato just doesn't address that. No one, not in any of his
But
dialogues,
you wouldn't want
does
to,
that
though,
come up.
would you? Because that is the never-ending. It's a never-ending cycle at that point. So
Yeah.
I would
Yeah.
imagine, that's something he probably did ponder, but wouldn't have wanted to address it because it takes apart it dismantles the whole thing. But I mean, just that as an allegory, the cave. I mean, you could view that as an allegory for various stages of your life. If you take the other elements of what he said, things are constantly in flux. Not that he would have said that, obviously, but reading into it, you could take that as the constant thing.
I think even though it seems like Plato really believed that to be sort of kind of literally true. It's a bit odd to say that literally true, but even though it seemed like he thought that was a true thing, I don't think that. I don't believe that. But as an allegory, purely as an allegory, as a metaphor, I think it's extremely interesting and valuable.
It's a great allegory.
Um,
Really, really good.
yeah,
Really
yeah.
good. It's that epiphany moment, isn't it, that people tend to have. Some people tend to have these epiphany moments. So yeah, that's a great allegory. It's really, really good. Really poignant, powerful.
So let's move on to then the next main thing. So I realise we've been going for a bit of time now. So move on to his ethics, really, or more. What this channel is a bit more about is supposed to be sort of politics themed, politics based. Is Plato's politics, or his ideas surrounding laws, surrounding the state, surrounding concepts of justice. So the Republic is just as it says on the tin, a discussion about what the best republic would be, or what the best sort of polity would be, the best way for collectives of people how to live. What is a good state? That was one of the things. Just like Socrates, Plato was obsessed with, and I don't mean that in a bad way. Obsessed with the nature of what was good. What does it mean for anything to be good? Like, is there such a thing as a good constitution? Is there such a thing as a good republic? And if so, what is it? What would it look like? So the republic is supposed to be a discussion just about justice. What is justice? Because again, we go back to the 4th century BC, ancient Greece. All the different city-states. There was no Greece, there was just city-states. And they all had a different way of doing things, basically, a different concept of justice, a different concept of exactly how their polity is run. And so the first thing you say is, well, they can't all be right. Some are better than others, aren't they? We can agree on that, even if we don't necessarily agree on what is the perfect or good one. But we can say some are closer to the good than others, and so on and so on. I do advise anyone, if you're even remotely interested, read or listen to The Republic. It's worth it. It's interesting in and of itself, I think. So, yeah, the concept. Could Athens ever really have, or the modern United States, could you have a perfect constitution, a good constitution? And so Plato would say, along with his idea of forms, that yes, there is there is such a thing as a good constitution, sort of a perfect one, that regardless of men, how corrupt men are, and how sort of riddled with desire and the ability to lie and all these sorts of things, regardless of all of that, regardless of where you are in the world and when you are in the world, there is the concept that you could have sort of a perfect republic, a utopia, right? So he's describing a utopia. Now, in all sorts of ways, it's good and interesting, and we could learn from it. And in lots of other ways, when you actually read it, it's like, that's weird and mad, because he goes into crazy detail. He ends up going into crazy detail, talking about, we'll have exactly this number of houses, and each house will have exactly this amount of garden to it, and we'll have this number of temples, and the boys and the girls will be educated like this, and when they reach this age, we'll take them away from their parents and do this with them, and these are the exact punishments for all these crimes, and we'll have no poets and no laughing, and
no laughing. Wow, bloody hell!
At one point, yeah.
Sounds great. Sounds like a riot.
But he contradicts himself, because in other ways he says, like that pleasure is important. So, as I said right near the beginning, he says contradictory things. You can find contradictory things, he says. So really, his idea of the sort of the utopian republic is a really, really specific description of a place, in his mind, that you could bring about the real thing. And a lot of the discussion is about, well, if men are capable of dreaming up such a thing, why have we not done it? It seems possible. We're capable of almost anything, aren't we? If we got enough of us together that all agreed on it, why can't we do it? Why hasn't it ever happened before?
Well, that's the clincher, isn't it? Agreement. Human nature. Disagreeable. Yeah.
I mean, he says that the ideal republic would only have 5,040 people in it. So if you could find 5,040 people that all agreed on his view of it, it might be doable, but in loads of other ways, it's completely impractical and it's not doable. So it's complete pie in the sky, semi-nonsense in other ways. Anyway, so yeah, he talks in, and it's in the Republic. He talks about the idea of the cave that is in the Republic, book 7, if I recall. But he says that you have to have a right amount of education. I mean, that's something Socrates talked about, that your collective, your city, your polity is only as good as the education system that everyone that's in it was brought up in. Right? So education is super, super important. And he had sort of what we would modern day we would call sort of a collectivist idea. He said that you take kids away from their parents when they're about 10, because their parents might bring them up badly and give them stupid, silly, wrong-headed ideas. So the state will deal with that. We'll take kids away from their parents when they're 10, and we'll make them work out outside the city, and we'll bring them up correctly. And at a certain age, when they're about 20 or so, we'll give them a test, just a general sort of test about ethics as well. And if they pass it, they get to do another 10 years of education. If they fail it, which most people are expected to fail it, then you finish your education at that point. You go back into society, and you just become a general worker or an agrarian type worker. The ones that pass it, you then have another 10 years of education. You have another much, much harder test at the end of that. If you fail that, you then go on to be what he called auxiliaries, but it was probably something like an officer class, or perhaps a bureaucratic class. You'd be sort of a higher class of person, basically. And the small number that passed that, you get 5 more years of purely philosophical training, and then another 5 or 10 years was it to go and travel the world. And when you come back, you're 50 years old. There'll be hardly anyone that's actually got to this point. But when you come back, you're 50 years old. You're a well-rounded, like philosopher, ruler, king person, and you get to be in the oligarchy or the sole ruler of your republic. That was his system.
That's interesting. It's interesting. I mean, the weight of education is super important, but the weight of education from the state, the wrong hands, not
All
so
right.
good.
That's the obvious pitfall, isn't it? Like exactly, it's like, yeah. So who's teaching them throughout that, and what
Yeah,
exactly are they being taught?
yeah,
And yeah.
yeah.
Again, Plato doesn't ever explain it entirely. Doesn't explain it in super detail.
Mm,
So, I mean, he explains it a bit. Like when you're younger, when you're little kids between 10 and 20, it's mainly what does he talk about? It's sort of mainly training in music and gymnastics or physical training. It's mainly that. You only get to learn about philosophy if you've already proven yourself to be worthy of it.
mm,
Um, So there's lots of flaws with that view, with Plato's idea. But
mm.
is it any worse with ending up with someone like Joe Biden or Keir Starmer ruling us with like a 20% mandate? Is that better?
Yeah, when you look at it from that perspective, yeah.
Because Plato, like Socrates, pretty much hated democracy.
Mm,
He talked a lot about the ship of state, just like Socrates did. Well,
mm.
they think a lot of what Socrates said it's just Plato putting his own ideas in Socrates' mind. Talk
Yeah,
about the
yeah.
idea if you've got the captain of a ship, or you're going to pick the captain of a ship. The metaphor, the allegory, is the ship of state. Um, you don't pick the one that gives you the best speech.
Mm,
You don't pick the guy you like the most. You don't pick the guy that promises you that he will take the ship of state to some wondrous land. No, you pick a guy that's capable of sailing a ship.
yeah, yeah.
You want to pick the guy that knows how not to sink a ship.
Well, I mean, yeah,
Right?
that's a great one. Modern day, you wouldn't pick a fat personal trainer, would you?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
come on, train me, fatty. Like, no, obviously not. Like, obviously, that's not going to do it. Yeah,
The inverse of that I love is never trust a thin chef.
but this is true.
um, yeah, so he's saying, you need to be taught to be a statesman. That's
Mm,
what his academy was largely about. He was trying to raise up a generation of men. In Athens, it would be just men, really. Although he does talk about equality of genders as well. He
mm.
does talk about that when you take the kids when they're 10 years old, it's boys and girls. But anyway, largely, and there's a slave class underneath it all, and that's correct and good and the way it should be, and let's not question that too much. Uh, he wanted to raise with his academy a cadre of men that would be well-rounded statesmen,
Hmm.
that would be capable. They would be good captains of the ship. That they wouldn't be corrupt. We'd wheedle out all the men that are corrupt and venal and all the things that make for a bad statesman.
Hmm.
So that was his idea. It's not a terrible idea, is it? Really?
No, it's not terrible. I mean, if you're committed to doing all of that in the last 50 years, I mean, you're pretty committed to that as a concept to being the best possible statesman ever. So, yeah, it's not bad. It's not bad. Certainly better than what we've got at the moment, where any old tard can be voted in, basically. And boy, we've got some in the UK right now. My God, they haven't got a brain cell amongst them. Lowest IQ.
David Lammy as our foreign secretary. No, I want a Plato's Republic way of educating philosopher kings to be our
So
leaders. Actually, I'd
embarrassing.
rather that. Yeah, I know. Um, um, so, although your criticism you had there is it's the first go-to thing you think of. It's like, well, what if that academy
Mm,
gets subverted so that they, instead of churning out brilliant, enlightened philosopher leaders, it's for whatever reason it gets perverted
yeah,
and it
yeah.
just churns out insanely violent, uh, demagogic tyrants.
Yeah, which could
What
do.
what
Yeah.
what if that happens?
Have to have checks and balances in
What then?
place. This is the thing, isn't
Yeah.
there? Everything on a conceptual level is all about virtue and roses, but human nature can take over, and humans at their very it's easy for a human to be nasty. Actually, I think it's very, very easy
Mm.
for a human to be violent. It's very easy for a human to act on impulse rather than practice impulse control. It's very, very easy, having self-awareness to, and also awareness of one's actions. That's significantly harder. It is significantly harder to remain controlled, calm, and collected, and also just generally speaking to be happy, positive, etc. You know, um,
Mm. Mm.
so yeah, human nature
No,
takes over, and then you're kind of screwed, really.
you're absolutely right. With history, if it shows us nothing else, that nearly all people have got inside them the ability, the gear, to do terrible, terrible things. The banality of evil.
Mm,
People that do terrible genocides often have got no past of being violent or cruel.
yep.
That's a crazy truth. That people like in the Khmer Rouge or the
Yeah.
NKVD in the Soviet Union or the Nazi death camp people, whatever, they're not serial killer people.
Yeah.
They're that's a really disquieting thing. Yeah, you have to learn to be good.
Mm,
So Jean-Jacques Rousseau, said that all children, are born perfect, perfectly good, perfectly ethically sound, and it's only the world of men and priests and kings that corrupts them and turns them into adults that do frightful things. And someone like Locke said, no, and I agree. I completely disagree with Rousseau on this. No, 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 no.
yeah.
You see little kids do really cruel, horrible things.
Oh yeah, they can be nasty.
Really cruel. Yeah. It's like, no, you have to be taught to be good. You're not born good.
Yeah. Yeah.
No,
No, 100%. That is wrong. Like it's, they
yeah.
say that, don't they? Like school kids are the absolute worst. School, like the things
Yeah.
that school kids do to one another is horrendous, absolutely awful. It's your sort of
Or
rational
even
thinking.
sometimes,
Oh, sorry.
yeah, yeah. No, sorry to interrupt. Sorry.
I was just going to say it's rational thinking, isn't it? Like the rationality of the brain. It's an ever developing thing up until a certain point. You have that's if that is a developing progress, a developing system. That by its very nature, predicates that good is a learned. It's a learned thing, isn't it? It's cultural as well. Goodness in cultures are completely like that's different per culture. So
And unfortunately, in some people, perhaps a lot of people, is their innate sort of default
mm,
is to be violent and cruel. Sometimes you get a kid, and he's old enough to sort of be able to empathise, say like a 6 or 7 or 8 year old, and he just kills a cat.
mm,
Like you've got there's a kitten and he just kills it. Right, some little kids they see like picking legs off an insect or using a magnifying glass to sort of burn a frog or something really something pretty cruel and horrible.
mm,
And they're a little kid. No one told them one way or another whether it's good or bad, whether they're allowed to or not. There's none of that involved. They just did it.
mm, yeah.
So there's something innate in them. Um, Even an anecdote: a friend of the family, they had a kid and he was like 7, and they brought a kitten home, and he killed it. He was petting it apparently, and then like started sort of patting it, and then just kept hitting it harder and harder and harder, and it knocked it out, and it never came round, and he killed it.
Jesus.
And it was just a little kid, and like he didn't grow up to become a serial killer. He grew up to be a normal
Mm,
person, but in him was that
impulse
on some
control, I
level.
guess, to a degree, isn't it? Really, which again comes from
He
the
had to be
brain.
taught to be good. So okay. Um, so there's lots of other things Plato talks about, all sorts of things. As I say, so many treatises that we just can't possibly go into them all. I mean, what does he talk about? He talks about the nature of friendship, the nature of courage, the nature of poets and poetry, the nature of what is or isn't beautiful. All sorts of ideas just about language. That's a classic thing philosophers, even in the ancient world, love to
Mm.
argue about. Like, what do we mean by the words we're using? That sort of thing. The nature of rhetoric. Yeah, and as he got older, he definitely seemed to have sort of his thinking changes or grows. Um, but yeah, I suppose we should sort of think about leaving it there. But the one thing I would say to people is, if they are interested, the place to really start, get an audiobook
Mm.
of the Republic, um, and just listen to that, because it's a great place to start. And even if you disagree, which I think a lot of most people will disagree with at least something in there. Most modern people, there'll be one or two things at least where you're like, that, you're sorry, Plato. That's crazy. You're wrong. But it's interesting and valuable in and of itself. And as we said about Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, it's just the foundation
Mm.
of the Western tradition. It's just the foundation of our politics, of our way of thinking. And of course, there's a good couple millennia, best part of a millennia, 2.5 millennia of stuff built on top of that. So, well, as just an introduction, I hope I've been able to give Plato, do him some credit.
Mm.
And yeah, have you got any sort of other thoughts or feelings?
No, not really. I think we can dip back into this as we once we round out um, Aristotle, and then we move on. I think we can dip back into some of this stuff here and there, and sort of discuss some of the key philosophies as and when. But no, I think that well covered it. So
Cool. Yeah. Well, when we do Aristotle, he's got criticisms of Plato. He says, well, Socrates said this, and Plato said he agrees with Socrates, but later in life, Plato said this instead, and they can't both be right, and I think this. So Aristotle is a nice sort of capstone, if you like, on this little corner of
our little
philosophy.
venture into Greek philosophy.